By the time I got to the south fence, the workers were already halfway through my pasture. One man was driving stakes into the ground. Another was unloading gravel. And right in the middle of my field, where my cattle had been grazing that same morning, a fresh strip of dirt cut across the grass like someone had decided my land was suddenly public. At first, I honestly thought they had the wrong property. Then I saw the little sign leaning against the trailer. Future Community Bike Path. That was the moment my stomach dropped. Because this was not empty land. It was not a greenbelt. It was not one of those abandoned fields developers forget about and neighbors slowly claim for themselves. This pasture was active cattle land. My herd was rotated through it every week. The fences mattered. The gates mattered. Even the quiet parts of that field mattered. And the HOA had just sent a full crew through it like they were building a walking trail in a city park. I asked the foreman who told him he could come onto my property. He barely looked up from his clipboard. He just said, "The board signed off on it." That answer would have been stupid anywhere. On active cattle land, it was dangerous. Because once that path opened, it would not just be gravel and tire tracks crossing my pasture. It would be people. And people were about to learn exactly why that field was never meant for them. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I have lived on that land long enough to know when something feels off before anyone says a word. Most people looked at my pasture and saw open space. They saw green grass, a fence line, and cattle moving slow in the distance. To them, it looked quiet, harmless, maybe even empty. That was exactly why people kept making the same mistake. From the road, a working pasture does not look busy. It does not look dangerous. It does not look like a place where one stupid decision can turn into a real problem in under a minute. But I knew every part of that field. I knew where the ground stayed soft after rain. I knew which gate had to stay shut and which one had to stay clear for feed trucks. I knew where the cattle liked to bunch up when the wind changed, and where they drifted when strangers got too close to the fence. I knew which stretch of grass looked calm until one animal got nervous and the whole herd started moving like a wave. This was not decorative land. It was not one of those big country properties people buy because they like the view and want to say they own acreage. I worked this place. I maintained the fences myself. I checked water lines. I tracked rotations. I watched the herd closely enough to know which calf spooked easy, which steer tested pressure, and which cows got protective when anything unfamiliar entered their space. That was why the scene in front of me felt so wrong. The workers were acting like they were in some unused back lot behind a subdivision. One man was measuring distance with a wheel. Another was hammering stakes into the ground like he had all the permission in the world. Bags of gravel were stacked near the trailer. Orange paint marks ran through the field in a straight line, cutting across a section I used every week. And just beyond all of that, near the far trough, 3 of my cattle had already stopped grazing. They were watching. That was the part most people never understood. Cattle do not need chaos to react. Sometimes all it takes is a new sound, a strange shape, repeated movement where there should not be any, a loud voice, a bright vest, a gate left half open. And these men had brought all of it with them. I could already see one of the younger steers shifting his weight. Another animal lifted its head higher and turned toward the noise. The workers either did not notice or did not care. They kept moving deeper into the pasture, laughing, pointing, stepping over ground they had no business touching. While the HOA's bright little plan started taking shape right through the middle of active cattle land. I did not start shouting. I did not run over there waving my arms like a crazy man. I just started walking toward them, slow and steady, trying to understand how far this had already gone before I stepped in. The closer I got, the worse it looked. What I thought were just a few random markings were actually layout lines. Someone had planned this. Stakes were set at measured intervals. A narrow strip of top grass had already been scraped back. One worker was spraying bright paint along the route while another checked something on a folded site map. This was not a misunderstanding that had started 5 minutes ago. This was a project. A real one, with equipment, labor, and enough confidence behind it that nobody on that crew seemed even slightly unsure about being there. Then I saw where the line was heading. Straight through the center lane, I used to move cattle from the upper field down toward water. I stopped right there for a second and just looked at it. That path was not hugging the edge of the property. It was not cutting through some useless corner. It was crossing one of the worst possible spots they could have chosen. If people started riding bikes through there even once, it would throw off my rotation pattern immediately. Gates would have to stay closed differently. Movement would change. The herd would start hesitating at a route they had used for years. And if even one rider thought it was funny to stop and take pictures near the fence, I could end up with stressed animals pressing the wrong direction all at once. By then a man in a clean polo shirt had stepped out from behind the trailer. He was not part of the work crew. He looked too polished for that. He had loafers on, sunglasses, and the kind of forced calm people use when they already think they are in charge. He gave me a tight smile before I even reached him. "Morning," he said. "You must be Mr. Mercer." That got my attention fast. If he knew my name, then this was not some contractor mix-up. They knew exactly whose land they were on. I asked him what exactly they thought they were doing in my pasture. He glanced back at the workers, then at the painted line, like he was proud of it. "We're beginning phase 1 of the community bike trail," he said. "It'll run behind the neighborhood and connect to the green space on the east side." He said it like he was announcing a gift. I looked at him for a second, waiting for the part where he explained why that had anything to do with my property. It never came, so I asked the only question that mattered. "Who gave you permission to build anything on my land?" His smile changed a little then, not gone but tighter, more careful. "The HOA board approved the route last month," he said. "This section is necessary for access." Necessary. That word sat there between us while one of my cattle let out a low, uneasy sound from farther back in the field. The man in the polo either did not hear it or did not understand what it meant. Behind him, the workers kept moving. One of them dragged a bundle of posts closer to the fence line. Another stepped over the exact track my cattle used to move through that section. I told him the board did not own this pasture. They had no right to mark it, cross it, or build on it. I told him if he had any sense at all, he would stop the crew right now and get every machine off my field before he created a problem he could not control. He listened without interrupting. Then he folded his arms and looked past me at the herd like they were part of the scenery. And when he spoke again, his voice had that smooth, practiced tone people use when they think being calm makes them correct. He said the neighborhood had been promised a safe outdoor path. He said residents wanted better access. He said the board had reviewed the land and did not see any issue with shared use. Shared use. I turned and looked out over my pasture at the fresh paint, the stakes, the open trailer, and the cattle standing still in the distance. Already paying attention to things they should never have had to notice. I did not start yelling. I did not run across the field like some maniac trying to make a scene. I just started walking toward them, slow and steady, trying to understand how something this stupid had already gotten so far before anyone thought to contact me. The closer I got, the worse it looked. What I first took for a few random markings were actually layout lines. Stakes had been driven into the ground at measured intervals. A narrow strip of grass had already been cut back. One worker was spraying bright paint along the route while another checked notes on a folded site map. This was not some confused contractor who had pulled onto the wrong property by mistake. This was planned. Someone had approved this. Someone had measured it. Someone had spent money on it. Then I saw where the line was going. Straight through the center lane, I used to move cattle from the upper field down toward water. That was when I stopped, not because I was shocked anymore. Because I was doing the math in my head. If that path opened even for one weekend, people would treat it like public space. Cyclists would come through fast. Kids would wander off the trail. Gates would get touched. Fence lines would get leaned on. Someone would stop for pictures. Someone would make noise. And the herd would start reacting to movement where there had never been movement before. Once cattle lose confidence in a route, they do not just magically settle down because a homeowner wants a scenic shortcut. That was when a man in a clean polo stepped out from behind the trailer. He was not part of the work crew. He looked too polished for that. Sunglasses, loafers, clipboard, the kind of man who looked comfortable giving orders on land he did not own. He smiled before I even reached him. "Morning," he said. "You must be Mr. Mercer." That got my attention fast. If he knew my name, then this was not an accident. They knew exactly whose pasture they were standing in. I asked him what they thought they were doing. He turned and looked proudly at the painted line cutting through my field. "We're beginning phase 1 of the community bike trail," he said. "This section connects the neighborhood to the east green space." He said it like he was announcing a benefit. I looked at him for a second, waiting for the part where he explained why that had anything to do with my land. It never came, so I asked the only question that mattered. "Who gave you permission to build anything in my pasture?" His smile tightened, but it did not disappear. "The HOA board approved the route last month," he said. "This section is necessary for access." Necessary. That word sat there between us while one of my cattle lifted its head in the distance and stared straight at the crew. I told him the board did not own this land, and whatever meeting they had held behind closed doors meant absolutely nothing out here. This pasture was private property. It was active cattle land. And if he had any sense at all, he would stop the crew, load everything back up, and get off my field before they created a problem none of them were ready for. He listened with that same polished expression, like I was giving feedback on landscaping, instead of warning him about a working pasture full of live animals. Then he folded his arms and glanced past me toward the herd. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "the neighborhood has needed a safe recreation path for years. The board reviewed the route carefully. We were told this section wasn't being used in any meaningful way." For a second, I honestly thought I had heard him wrong. Not being used in any meaningful way. I turned and looked out across the field. The water trough sat near the far fence. The feed access lane cut across the lower side. Fresh hoof marks ran through the grass from that same morning. 3 cattle were still standing still, watching the workers. Another had started drifting away from the noise. Nothing about that land was idle. Nothing about it was decorative. Just because it didn't look busy from the road didn't mean it wasn't working every day. I asked him who exactly had told them the pasture wasn't active. He gave me a vague answer. Somebody on the planning side. Somebody who had reviewed maps, somebody who believed shared use would not interfere with normal operations. Shared use. That phrase alone told me everything. They had built this whole idea around the fantasy that land stays harmless, just because people want it to be convenient. They thought a few signs and a strip of gravel could somehow turn cattle ground into neighborhood green space. They were seeing a picture on paper. I was seeing gates, movement, stress points, and 600 pounds of animal instinct that did not care what the HOA had promised residents. Behind him, the crew kept working. A post went into the ground near the exact section where I usually turned the herd during rotation. One man dragged a bundle of narrow rails toward the fence line. Another rolled a wheel over the painted route, checking distance like he had no reason in the world to stop. I could hear metal clinking, gravel shifting, boots pressing into soil that had no business carrying a public trail. Then I noticed something that made the whole situation even worse. One of the side gates had been left partly open. Not wide, just enough. Enough for a curious calf. Enough for a nervous animal to test space it should not have had. Enough for a bad idea to become a real mess in seconds. I looked from that gate to the men in the field, then out toward the herd again, and this time more than a few heads were up. I pointed at the gate and told the man in the polo to have someone shut it right now. He turned, looked at it, and gave the kind of half-shrug people give when they do not understand what they are looking at. To him, it was just a gate sitting a little loose on a fence line. To me, it was the kind of small mistake that starts a chain reaction no one can stop once it begins. One of the workers started toward it, but he was in no hurry. He was smiling at something another guy had said, boots dragging through the grass like there was all the time in the world. There was not. Out near the trough, the younger steer I had been watching shifted again. Then another animal turned sideways. Then the whole little cluster of cattle changed posture in that quiet way people miss if they do not know what to look for. Heads up, ears forward, weight moving, attention locked. I knew that look. They were not charging. They were not wild, not yet. They were deciding. That was the part city people never understood. Trouble with cattle does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it starts with stillness, a strange sound, a repeated movement, a human standing where no human should be. Then one animal reacts, another follows, and suddenly the whole field feels different. I told the crew to stop moving. Nobody listened. The man in the polo kept talking. Still trying to sell me on the path like this was some boardroom disagreement and not a live situation inside a pasture. He said the neighborhood had already budgeted the first stage. He said residents were excited. He said the board believed this trail would improve property values and community life. I barely heard him. My eyes were on the herd. One of the workers near the paint line bent down to pick something up. The motion was fast enough to catch the attention of the steer. The animal lifted its head high, then took 2 short steps sideways. Another followed, then a third, not toward the men, just enough movement to tell me the tension was spreading. I started walking past the polo-shirted idiot and into the field. He called after me, asking where I thought I was going, and I almost laughed at that. Where did I think I was going? Onto my own land. To fix the situation his board had created before one of these fools got hurt and tried to blame me for it. I reached the half-open gate and grabbed it just as a calf on the other side drifted closer than I wanted. The chain was hanging loose. Someone had unhooked it and never secured it again. I pulled it shut hard, fastened it, and turned back toward the crew. "Drop the tools," I said. "Get your people out of the pasture." The workers finally looked at me like I was serious. The man in the polo did not. He took a few steps closer and lowered his voice like that would somehow make him sound more reasonable. "Mr. Mercer, there is no need to overreact." Overreact. That word had barely left his mouth when one of the cattle let out a deep, sharp bellow from across the field, and every worker in that pasture froze. Every head in that field came up at once. The change was immediate. 1 second the workers were laughing, dragging tools through the grass, acting like they were laying a trail in some empty greenbelt behind a subdivision. The next, the entire pasture felt different, quiet but not calm, still but not safe. Even the men who had been joking a moment earlier stopped talking when they realized the herd was no longer ignoring them. Out near the trough, the cattle had gathered their attention into one direction. Us, not charging, not yet. Just watching in that hard, fixed way livestock watches when something unfamiliar stays in the wrong place for too long. The younger steer had moved closer to the others. A larger cow stepped forward and planted herself. Dust shifted around their hooves, tails flicked, ears stayed forward. Their bodies looked steady, but I knew what I was seeing. Tension was building. I told the crew not to move. Then one of them made the worst possible choice. A worker near the painted root took 2 quick steps backward, caught his boot in the cut grass, and dropped a metal post driver. It hit the ground with a sharp crack that echoed across the field. 3 animals flinched at once. Another spun sideways. Then the whole cluster shifted like a single mind had passed through them. That was all it took. The workers panicked before the cattle did. One man bolted toward the trailer. Another stumbled toward the fence without even looking where he was going. A third climbed onto a stack of gravel bags like being 2 feet higher would somehow protect him. The man in the polo had gone pale. He kept asking if the animals were dangerous, but the confidence in his voice was gone now. I did not even look at him when I answered. "They don't have to be angry," I said. "They just have to react." Another bellow rolled across the pasture, louder this time. A cow near the center tossed her head and took a few stiff steps forward. Not a charge, not yet. But enough movement to send fear through the crew. Boots slipped, tools scattered, somebody yelled for the truck keys. One of the men near the half-cut trail nearly fell trying to run across the very route they had marked for public access. And right there, with dust lifting, cattle focused, and grown men scrambling over their own equipment, the truth finally hit all of them at once. This had never been open space. It was active cattle land. The crew did not need a full stampede to understand how bad this was getting. The panic on their faces told me they had finally stopped seeing my pasture as a blank piece of land and started seeing it for what it really was. A live working field. A place where one bad call could put people, animals, fences, and property all in the same mess at once. I moved toward the workers nearest the marked path and told them to back away slowly, keep their hands down, and stop shouting. The last thing I needed was more sudden motion. One man was breathing so hard he could barely listen. Another kept looking over his shoulder like he expected the whole herd to explode into a run at any second. The man in the polo had gone completely quiet now. He was no longer talking about community access or improved property values. He was just staring at the cattle and trying to figure out how a bike trail had turned into a liability nightmare in under 5 minutes. I got the nearest worker through the fence first, then another. Then the man who had climbed onto the gravel bags jumped down too fast, almost twisted his ankle, and half ran toward the trailer. I pointed him away from the open area and told him to move along the fence, not across the field. He listened this time. Funny how quickly people learn when the land starts teaching instead of the owner. The cattle were still keyed up. They had not charged, but they had not relaxed either. A few kept pacing in place. One cow gave another low warning sound. The younger steer was moving his head from side to side, reading every person, every tool, every shape left standing where it did not belong. Even after the workers started retreating, the damage was already done. Their smell was in the field. Their noise had cut across the herd's routine. The painted line still slashed through the movement lane like an insult. I turned back to the man in the polo and told him to call off the entire job. Right now, not after a meeting. Not after a review, right now. He swallowed, pulled out his phone, and looked at the half-finished path, the stacked gravel, the scattered tools. And the workers pressed against the fence line, waiting for someone smarter than them to take control. Then he looked at me and said the one thing that told me this still was not over. He said, "The board is going to want to discuss this first." That was when I realized these people still did not understand the difference between inconvenience and trespass. I stared at him for a second, honestly wondering whether fear had knocked the sense out of him or if he had never had any to begin with. The workers were pinned along my fence line, the cattle were still keyed up, tools were scattered across my pasture. And this man was talking about a board discussion, like we were scheduling a landscaping vote for next Tuesday. I told him there was nothing left to discuss. His crew had entered private land without permission. They had cut a route through an active movement lane. They had left a gate unsecured. They had disturbed livestock. And if one person got hurt trying to run from a situation his board created, that would be on them, not me. I expected every tool, every marker, every bag of gravel, and every vehicle off my land immediately. He did not argue this time, not directly. But he did what people like him always do when reality starts cornering them. He reached for delay. He said he needed to call the board president. I said, "Call whoever you want." "But your people are leaving first." That was when his phone finally came out. He stepped a few feet away, kept glancing at the herd, and started talking in a low, urgent voice. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough. Liability, cattle, private owner, unsafe. Those were the words that mattered. His tone had changed completely. Gone was the polished confidence. Now he sounded like a man trying to explain why a simple neighborhood project had turned into a legal problem with hooves. While he was on the phone, I moved through the field with the crew and made sure they took everything they could carry without creating more noise. Stakes came out. Tools were gathered. One worker folded up the site map with shaking hands. Another dragged the paint cans back toward the trailer. Nobody laughed now. Nobody acted like they belonged there. Every one of them kept looking over their shoulder at the herd, which had settled just enough to stay in place, but not enough for me to trust them around strangers any longer. Then the man in the polo came back toward me and said the board president wanted to speak with me directly. I told him no, not because I was angry, because I was done talking informally. If the HOA wanted to explain why they thought they could build a public bike path through active cattle land, they could do it in writing. They could put every bad assumption on paper. They could tell me exactly who approved it, exactly what they thought they owned, and exactly why nobody had bothered to check with the man whose pasture they had just turned into a hazard. By the time the last worker hauled his tools back to the trailer, my pasture looked worse than it had an hour earlier. Fresh paint still cut through the grass in a bright line. Tire marks pressed into the soft ground near the fence. A few stakes had been pulled, but not all of them. The gravel bags were loaded again, yet the damage was still sitting there in plain sight, like the HOA had signed its name across my field and expected me to live with it. I stood there and watched them leave, making sure every truck rolled back through the gate and onto the road before I even looked at my phone. The moment they were gone, I started documenting everything. Every paint mark, every disturbed patch of grass, every boot print near the movement lane. every section where they had crossed fencing or dragged equipment through active pasture. I took wide shots first, then close shots, then video. I walked the full route they had marked and recorded every foot of it, speaking the time, the date, and the location out loud as I went. I wanted a clean record of exactly what they had done before anyone from the HOA had time to come back later and pretend this had all been some harmless misunderstanding. Because that was how people like this survived their own mistakes. They rewrote the story. First it was a community improvement, then it would become a small mix-up, then an overreaction. Then somehow, if you let them talk long enough, it would become your fault for not being more cooperative. I had seen that pattern before. Not on this scale and not with cattle involved, but enough to know that the first person who writes the facts down usually controls what happens next. So I kept going. I photographed the half-open gate they had left unsecured. I documented the churned soil around the route. I recorded the cattle from a distance too, because their behavior mattered. The herd was calmer now, but not settled. A few animals were still standing in the wrong part of the field, watching the area where the workers had been. Their routine had been interrupted, and anyone who knew livestock would have seen it immediately. Then I went back to the house, pulled the property file from my office cabinet, and laid every document across the kitchen table. Deed, survey, boundary map, fence maintenance records, agricultural use paperwork, and then the one thing I already suspected the HOA had never bothered to check before carving a trail through my land: the easement file. I opened the easement file expecting carelessness. What I found was worse than that. It was proof that the HOA had built this whole plan on confidence, not facts. There was only one recorded access easement touching the edge of my property, and it had nothing to do with recreation. It was narrow, specific, utility and maintenance only, no public trail. No bike access, no shared-use corridor. No language anywhere that gave a homeowner's association the right to cut a path through active pasture and invite residents onto it like they were opening a park. I read it twice just to make sure I was not missing something. Then I pulled the survey closer and traced the marked line again. Their route did not just brush the easement boundary. It crossed clean into land the HOA had no right to enter at all. That explained the confidence of the man in the polo, the vague talk about reviewed maps, and the way nobody had ever contacted me. They had probably glanced at one old property sketch, seen a line, and assumed it meant access. To people who did not understand land, every line on paper looked like permission. It was not. I took photos of the easement pages and sent them to my attorney. Then I sent him the videos from the pasture, the photos of the paint marks, the open gate, the scattered tools, and the route they had cut through my cattle lane. He called me back faster than I expected. His first question was simple. Did anyone from the HOA ask for written permission before this started? No. Did they notify you in any form? No. He was quiet for a second after that. The kind of silence lawyers have when the facts are getting better for you by the second and worse for the other side. Then he asked if any residents had already used the path. I told him not yet, but they had gotten close. The route was marked. The signs were there. The crew had clearly intended to open it. That helps, he said. Because once they start inviting public use onto agricultural land they do not control, the exposure changes. Exposure. That word landed hard because it was bigger than trespass, bigger than property damage, bigger than a board trying to bully the wrong landowner. The HOA had not just crossed a line. They had created risk, real risk, for residents, for contractors, for livestock, for me. My attorney told me not to speak to the board president, not by phone, not casually. Not even to clear things up. He said every contact from this point forward needed to be in writing, clean, direct, preserved. So I sat down at the kitchen table, documents spread around me, photos still open on my phone, and started building the timeline minute by minute. Because if the HOA wanted to turn my pasture into a public bike path, then I wanted every bad decision tied to a name, a date, and a piece of paper. I started with the first thing that mattered most. Time, what time the crew entered, what time I reached the south fence, what time I saw the sign, what time I found the gate unsecured, what time the herd changed behavior. What time the crew finally pulled out. Then I built the rest around it. Who was there, what equipment they brought, what part of the pasture they crossed. What they said when I asked who gave them permission. Every detail went down exactly as it happened, while it was still fresh, and before anyone from the HOA could start cleaning up their version of events. I wrote down the man in the polo's exact words. The board approved the route last month. This section is necessary for access. The board is going to want to discuss this first. Those 3 lines alone told the whole story. They had approved something they did not own, claimed need where no right existed, then tried to slow everything down after the danger became obvious. That was not confusion. That was overreach. My attorney sent back a short reply an hour later. Good record, keep going, send names if you get them, so I did. I zoomed in on every truck logo, every contractor label, every tag number I could read from the photos and video. One trailer had a landscaping company name on the side. Another vehicle had a temporary permit taped inside the windshield. The sitemap one worker had folded up too late showed enough detail in my video for me to pause and catch the project title printed across the top. Silver Ridge HOA Multi-Use Trail Phase 1. Seeing it in writing made my jaw tighten. This was bigger than one arrogant board member with a bad idea. They had named it, budgeted it, planned phases for it. That meant meetings, emails, votes. Probably drawings, maybe vendor bids, plenty of chances for someone to ask the most basic question in the world. Do we actually have the right to build this? Nobody had asked. Or maybe someone had, and the board decided not to hear the answer. Just before sunset, my attorney called again and told me he was drafting a formal demand letter. Immediate cease and desist. Preservation of all records. No further entry. Removal of markers and materials. Written identification of every board member, contractor, and manager involved. He also wanted a copy sent to the HOA's insurer if we could identify it, because once insurance saw unauthorized public access and active cattle land in the same paragraph, the tone on their side would change fast. I looked out the kitchen window toward the pasture, where the last of the light was fading over fresh paint, marks the board had no business putting there at all. The letter went out the next morning. Not an angry email, not a phone call. Not some back-and-forth argument the HOA could twist later into miscommunication. A formal demand, sent through my attorney, with every word chosen to make one thing clear from the first line. They had entered private agricultural land without permission. They had marked, disturbed, and partially developed a route through active cattle pasture. They had created a safety risk for contractors, residents, livestock, and the property owner. And from that moment forward, every single thing tied to that project had to stop. The letter demanded immediate confirmation that all work was suspended. It required the HOA to preserve every email, text message, meeting note, vendor invoice, site drawing, contractor instruction, and internal discussion connected to the trail. It ordered them not to remove or alter records, not to re-enter my property, and not to communicate with me outside formal written channels. By noon, the first response came in. Not from the board president, from the management company. That alone told me panic had already started spreading through the right offices. Their email was careful, polite, vague. They said they were looking into the matter. They said they had not yet reviewed the full scope of the project approval. They said they hoped the issue could be resolved cooperatively while they gathered information from the board and contractors. Gathered information. That phrase was doing a lot of work. Because nobody gathers information after doing something right. People gather information when they realize they are exposed and need to find out how bad it is before the blame starts moving around. An hour later, my attorney forwarded me a second message, this one from the HOA's legal counsel. Short, formal, controlled. They wanted copies of the survey pages and the easement language we were relying on. They also asked whether any cattle had made physical contact with a contractor or resident. My attorney smiled when he read that part out loud over the phone. That question told us exactly where their heads were now. They were not asking whether the path would still move forward. They were trying to measure damage, trying to figure out whether they were dealing with trespass, property interference, or something that could turn into bodily injury exposure if one frightened animal had moved 3 feet farther at the wrong time. We sent the survey pages. We sent the easement section. We sent still images from the video showing the route line crossing directly through my movement lane. Then we waited. Not long. Before the afternoon was over, another email came through, and this one had a very different tone. No talk about community benefit. No mention of recreation access. No proud language about improving the neighborhood. Just a request for a temporary standstill while the board reviewed newly clarified ownership concerns and assessed contractor activity already completed on site. I read that email twice, and the phrase that stood out was not temporary standstill. It was newly clarified ownership concerns. That was their way of saying they had finally checked the facts and did not like what they found. Not once did they say they were sorry. Not once did they admit they had crossed private land without permission. Not once did they mention the gate, the cattle, the workers, or the route they had already cut through active pasture. They were still trying to shrink the story. Turn a reckless trespass into a paperwork issue. Turn a dangerous decision into a clarification. Turn their mistake into a misunderstanding that had somehow appeared out of nowhere. My attorney told them no standstill without conditions. If the HOA wanted breathing room, then we wanted control. No one entered my property for any reason. No workers, no board members. No contractors, no survey teams, no inspection visits. No resident use of the marked route. No cleanup without written agreement. No removal of evidence. And before anything else happened, we wanted the full list of everyone involved in approving, planning, funding, and ordering the trail. That was when the delay tactics started to crack. The management company responded first. They admitted they had acted based on direction from the board. The contractor claimed they were told the route had already been cleared for access. Then, late that evening, the board president finally sent something in writing. It was only 3 paragraphs long, but it told me everything. She said the board had acted in good faith to improve neighborhood safety and recreation. She said the trail route was selected based on long-standing assumptions about shared access behind the homes. She said no one intended to interfere with agricultural activity, and that any concern about livestock could have been resolved through a cooperative conversation if I had been willing to engage. Calmly, I stared at that last line for a long time. If I had been willing to engage calmly, as if I had not walked into my own pasture and found a crew already cutting a public path through it. As if I had not warned them while they kept working. As if a half-open gate, spooked cattle, and marked construction lines were all the result of my attitude instead of their arrogance. My attorney wrote back within the hour. He attached the photos again. The open gate, the marked route, the work crew inside the pasture, the survey, the easement language. Then he asked one question. If the board believed it had lawful shared access, why had it never once contacted the landowner before construction began? That question sat unanswered overnight. The next morning, just after 9, a new message came in from the HOA's attorney requesting an emergency conference call with the board, management company, insurer, and contractors. That was the moment I knew somebody important had finally explained the situation to them in plain English. The conference call happened that afternoon, and for the first time since this started, the HOA stopped sounding proud and started sounding nervous. I was on with my attorney. The board president was there. The management company was there. So was the contractor and, most importantly, a representative from the HOA's insurance carrier. That was the voice I had been waiting to hear, because insurance people do not care about anyone's vision for the neighborhood. They care about risk, paperwork, and whether somebody just created a claim that never should have existed. The call started with the board president trying to frame the whole thing as an unfortunate misunderstanding. She said the board had relied on old assumptions about access behind the homes. She said they believed the route fell within an area that had been treated as open for years. She said the goal was to create a safe space for families, cyclists, and walkers without disrupting surrounding landowners. My attorney let her talk. Then he asked whether the board had ever obtained written permission from me. No. Whether the board had reviewed the recorded easement language before approving construction. No clear answer. Whether the contractor had been told the land was active cattle pasture. Silence. That silence changed the whole meeting. The insurance representative cut in and asked the contractor to confirm whether workers had entered fenced agricultural land with equipment and route markings before ownership was verified. The contractor, to his credit, did not try to dance around it. He said yes. He also admitted the crew had been told access was already cleared by the HOA. Then the insurer asked whether the route had been intended for resident use once Phase 1 was complete. Again, yes. You could feel the pressure shift through the line. Now nobody was discussing scenic access or recreation value. Now it was all about unauthorized entry, unsafe exposure, livestock disturbance, and whether the HOA had invited public use onto land it did not control. The board president tried to interrupt twice, but every time she spoke, someone pulled the conversation back to records, notice, approval, and liability. By the end of the call, the insurer was no longer asking what the board meant to do. They were asking what had already been done, what evidence existed, and what steps would be taken immediately to prevent a second incident. Then came the first real concession. The HOA agreed to suspend the project indefinitely. Not pause it, not review it, suspend it. And once that word was on the record, the contractor started asking who would be responsible for the cost of removal, site repair, and crew loss from a job that never should have started in the first place. Once the contractor raised the cost issue, the board president stopped talking like this was still a neighborhood project and started talking like someone trying to survive a very bad paper trail. She said the board had acted with the best intentions. She said nobody expected the route to trigger this kind of dispute. She said the community had already invested time and planning into the trail. But none of that mattered now. Intent did not change the property line. Planning did not create permission, and a nice idea did not become legal just because a few homeowners liked it. The insurer asked the next question before anyone else could soften the moment. Had any resident already been notified that the path was opening soon? There was a pause. Then the management company admitted that a neighborhood update had gone out the week before. Not a full opening announcement, but enough to create expectation. Enough for families to think a new bike trail was coming. Enough for someone to show up early if the crew had finished faster that day. That answer hit harder than anything else on the call. Because now this was not just about trespass. It was about the HOA getting dangerously close to directing people toward active cattle land without checking ownership, use, safety, or basic legal rights first. A board that thought it was building a community feature had almost created the perfect setup for panic, injury, and lawsuits. The contractor wanted written confirmation that all work orders were canceled. The insurer wanted the route blocked immediately and every trail marker removed under controlled conditions. My attorney wanted repair terms, a written admission that the HOA had no recreational access rights across my pasture, and a commitment that no future board or contractor would enter the property without my express written consent. Nobody argued with that part. That was when I knew the balance had fully shifted. A day earlier, they had been speaking in the language of assumption, shared use, community need, safe recreation. Board approval. Now they were speaking in the language that appears when bad decisions finally meet consequences. Exposure, preservation, removal, suspension, repair. The board president tried one last time to say they had only wanted to improve the neighborhood. I almost laughed when I heard it. Because if they had really wanted to improve anything, they could have started with a phone call, a survey review, a property check. One basic conversation with a man who actually worked the land they were so eager to redesign from a distance. Instead, they sent trucks, tools, paint, gravel, and confidence into a field full of cattle, and acted surprised when the pasture reminded them it was never theirs to shape.